It was the winter of 1259 when word started spreading that some Polish farmers had stumbled across something strange out in their fields. They found Mongol scouts, or what was left of them, frozen solid on their horses. Both man and beast were locked in place, upright like eerie statues of ice, their lifeless eyes already picked clean by ravens. The villagers didn't bother burying them. Instead, they turned the whole scene into a kind of grim fairground. Folks set up little market stalls around the frozen corpses, selling hot soup and bread as if it were any other winter day, using the dead Mongols as ghastly decorations. Kids threw snowballs at the bodies for fun, while dogs wandered around and pissed on their boots. One clever merchant even hung a wooden sign from a frozen Mongol's stiff arm. It read, "Fresh bread, not made from human flesh like Mongol food." It wasn't fear anymore that the people felt. It was mockery, pure contempt. For 2 long decades, Europe had been haunted by the nightmare of the Mongols. Their speed, their savagery, their legend. But now, in the dead of winter, those same demons of the East had become sideshow attractions. Folks remembered the stories of Legnica, the battlefield where Mongol warriors filled 9 sacks with the severed ears of Europeans. They remembered the stories of skulls turned into drinking cups, even children's skulls. They remembered how 100,000 knights were cut down in just 3 days, their armor as useless as tin against the rain of Mongol arrows. They remembered whole cities wiped clean of human life, where only cats were left alive, because even the rats had been eaten by starving survivors. But by 1259, when the Golden Horde rode back into Poland expecting another easy slaughter, they met something they'd never faced before, an enemy that had learned from its nightmares. The Mongols were about to find out what happens when you teach peaceful farmers to become monsters. Without meaning to, they had created their own executioners. The Mongol army's strength lived and died with their horses. Every warrior traveled with half a dozen or more mounts, switching between them to stay fast and fresh. They drank their horses' blood when food ran out, made armor from their hides, and crafted arrows from their bones. A Mongol without horses wasn't a warrior at all, just a man in furs, stranded 1,000 miles from home. The Polish leader, Duke Boleslaw V, called the Chaste, though history would soon find that title ironic, had spent 20 years studying the enemy's every move. He knew the horses were the key. 3 months before the invasion, his men began what might have been the most ruthless scorched earth campaign Europe had ever seen. They poisoned the wells with rotting carcasses, burned every blade of grass across 50 miles, and salted the earth with lime and arsenic so nothing could grow. And then came the cruelest trick of all. They left behind gift horses, strong, beautiful Polish mares, deliberately infected with a deadly disease called glanders. It spread fast among horses, filling their lungs with pus until they drowned on dry land. When Nogai Khan led 30,000 Mongol riders across the Vistula River that December, his scouts didn't find conquered towns, they found silence. The land ahead wasn't just empty, it was dead. Blackened fields stretched for miles. Villages were deserted. Every well was choked with bloated horse carcasses. The Poles themselves had disappeared like smoke, taking every grain of food and even their dead with them. They dug up the bones from graveyards so the Mongols couldn't even grind skeletons for calcium. By the 2nd week, the Mongols' horses started to cough blood. Their necks swelled with sores that burst and spread infection. Not knowing how disease worked, the Mongols moved their sick mounts to the back of the lines, right next to the healthy ones. Within days, the sickness tore through the entire herd like wildfire. By the 3rd week, hundreds of horses were dying every single day. Their carcasses littered the snowy roads, a trail of rot that wolves followed like it was a moving banquet. And that's when the Polish ghosts began their work. Duke Boleslaw hadn't raised knights this time, he'd raised hunters. Men of the woods, farmers and trappers who knew how to move silently through snow, who had spent 20 bitter years dreaming of vengeance for their burned villages and murdered families. These weren't soldiers, they were survivors, and they'd been given one simple command: kill them like wolves. No honor, no mercy. Their tactics were brutally simple. They waited for the Mongol scouts to set up camp, then struck in the darkest hours before dawn. But they didn't charge in with swords. They didn't fight at all. They crept in, slit the throats of the Mongols' horses, and vanished back into the trees before the camp could even wake. When a warrior finally opened his eyes, he'd find all 5 of his mounts lying dead around him, the snow stained red beneath them, and not a single enemy in sight. Out there, deep in enemy territory with no horses and no supplies, a man like that was already dead. He just didn't know it yet. It only took a few more days of stumbling through frozen forests before realization set in. One Mongol unit, 500 men strong, woke to find every last horse dead, the animals laid out in a perfect circle around their camp, like a message written in blood and silence. The Poles pulled it off so quietly that even the night sentries didn't hear a thing. The message they left behind couldn't have been clearer. We can end you whenever we choose. The effect on the Mongols was brutal. These were men who'd conquered from China to Hungary. Now they were afraid to close their eyes. They'd always depended on fast raids and foraging for supplies, but the Poles turned that against them. They started planting fake supply caches. Barrels of mead, sacks of grain, smoked meat, all laced with hemlock and wolfsbane. Not enough to kill instantly, just enough to make every bite a living hell. Soon the invincible Mongols were doubled over with cramps, bleeding, delirious. One captain, Bedar, wrote to Nogai Khan, "The enemy is nowhere and everywhere. We rule over ghosts. My men bleed from both ends and see demons. Even the horses eat one another's manies. This land is cursed." By January of 1260, their army was collapsing. The few horses that hadn't died from disease were gnawing tree bark and dung just to stay alive, and eventually each other. Warriors who once lived off horse milk and blood now watched their starving mounts drop dead, too weak even to butcher. The Polish plan was working perfectly. They had turned their homeland into a graveyard that swallowed armies whole. And then came Sandomierz, where the trap was ready to spring. For weeks Duke Boleslaw had been retreating, always just out of reach, leaving behind poisoned food and burnt earth. By the time the Mongols cornered him near the Vistula River, their force had shrunk from 30,000 to maybe 15. They thought they had him trapped. They were dead wrong. The Duke had spent 2 months crafting a killing field meant just for them. What came to be called the Battle of Sandomierz wasn't a battle at all. It was an execution. As the Mongols rode up, they saw the Polish army laid out in the usual fashion. Knights in front, infantry behind, banners flying proudly. It looked like the same kind of formal European formation the Mongols had smashed 100 times before. Nogai Khan ordered the standard tactic, a fake retreat to lure the knights forward, then hit them with arrows. But this time, the Polish knights didn't chase. They held their ground, shields raised, silent. When the Mongols wheeled back for their arrow volley, they discovered why. Hidden beneath a thin dusting of snow were deep trenches and spike pits. The ground gave way under the hooves. Horses snapped their legs. Riders were thrown into pits lined with sharpened stakes smeared in filth to ensure every wound turned septic. The Poles had built the perfect counter to Mongol warfare. As the cavalry thrashed and screamed, Polish crossbowmen rose from behind hidden mounds. They didn't aim for the riders, they went for the horses. Every single one. They worked like butchers, calm and precise, cutting down the Mongols' only hope of mobility. In a matter of minutes, the feared horsemen of the east became stranded infantry, trapped in foreign snow hundreds of miles from help. That's when the peasants arrived. They came in droves, armed not with swords but with what they knew: flails for threshing grain, hooks for hay, hammers for ironwork. The Duke had promised them payment. A silver penny for every Mongol ear, 2 for a thumb, and a gold ducat for a commander's head. What followed wasn't a battle, it was a harvest. The Mongols tried to form tight circles on foot, but they were exhausted, poisoned, and wearing armor made for riders, not men on the ground. And the Polish farmers, the ones who'd once cowered in terror, moved in like reapers in winter. The peasants swarmed the Mongols like ants on a dying beetle. They swung harvest scythes to slice tendons, flails to smash skulls, and hooked blades to drag warriors into the mud, where hammers and stones finished the work. One Polish chronicler wrote that the Tartars died not as warriors, but as sheep in slaughter season. We peasants fought in teams, turning killing into craftwork, as methodical as threshing grain. The massacre, later called the ear harvest, lasted about 3 hours. Some men, ever practical, sliced off both ears even though the bounty paid for one, figuring they could sell the extras to those who hadn't killed enough. Others made necklaces from severed Mongol fingers, selling them as charms for protection. The Mongol officers, easy to spot by their silk and gold, were kept alive just long enough for peasants to argue over who'd claim the bounty. Then they were beheaded with pig-slaughtering axes, their screams blending with peasant work songs. It was the harvest we'd waited 20 years for, and we sang while we reaped. Nogaikon survived, but only because Duke Boleslaw wanted it that way. The Duke had a special punishment in mind. The Mongol general was stripped bare, painted with pig's blood, and forced to ride a donkey backward through 20 Polish villages while the locals pelted him with dung and rotten cabbage. In every village, people were allowed to slice off one small piece of him, a finger joint, a toe, an ear. Never enough to kill, just enough to make him wish for death. By the time he reached the last town, he was missing half his parts and begging for mercy. Instead, they castrated him with sheep shears and sent him limping back to the Golden Horde with a message. This is what Europe does to invaders now. Meanwhile, in Austria, King Ottokar II of Bohemia launched his own campaign of annihilation. The Battle of Kressenbrunn in July 1260 wasn't like Sandomir's. This was open-field warfare, knights in armor against Mongol cavalry. But the Bohemians had learned from 2 decades of humiliation. They built new tactics from the ground up. Instead of charging headlong, their troops formed hollow squares of pikes, like walking fortresses. Inside stood Swiss mercenaries with crossbows, ready to unleash death in controlled bursts. When Mongol arrows clattered harmlessly off improved plate armor, when their horses impaled themselves on walls of pikes, the Mongols realized their old methods no longer worked. Then the Bohemian heavy cavalry moved in, not the fragile knights of Legnica, but new warriors clad in full plate, riding massive destriers that crushed Mongol ponies under hoof. They wielded war hammers built to shatter Mongol lamellar armor. The slaughter was so complete that Ottokar ordered his men to stop taking ears. There were too many. Instead, they stacked Mongol heads into pyramids along the road from Vienna to Prague. More than 50 of them, each a grim monument of 100 or more skulls. But the worst fate was reserved for those who fled into the Carpathian Mountains. Winter there doesn't forgive. Around 3,000 survivors stumbled into the frozen passes with no food, no horses, and temperatures dropping to 30 below. The mountain villagers, Polish and Hungarian alike, had been warned. They felled trees to block passes, burned bridges, and waited. Starvation follows a pattern. First you eat leather, belts, boots, saddles. Then the horse carcasses, bark, pine needles. By the 4th week, you turn on each other. A Hungarian patrol eventually found one of their camps. The ground was littered with butchered bodies, carved with the same precision the Mongols once used on their victims. Muscles sliced clean, bones split for marrow, skin roasted like crackling. The survivors had made their own rules for feeding. The dying began to feed the living. First they ate the sick, then the wounded. When only the strong remained, they drew lots. One journal, found on a frozen corpse, held a confession. We ate Timur yesterday. He'd been my brother-in-arms for 6 years. His liver was black with disease, but we ate it anyway. Tomorrow they'll share me. The mountains are full of demons, and they wear the faces of peasants. Those demons were the mountain villagers, watching from the shadows. They rarely attacked outright. Winter was doing the killing for them. Only when a group weakened enough would the peasants strike, using hunting bows and boar spears. By spring, the snow revealed their work. Mongol corpses perfectly preserved, faces frozen in their final screams. Villagers stripped them of weapons, armor, gold teeth, anything useful, and left the rest for wolves. Some settlements even built a grim trade around the dead. Tendons became bowstrings, hair became brushes, skulls were polished into drinking cups. A cruel echo of what the Mongols had once done at Legnica. Every home kept a Mongol skull bowl used only on feast days. A few hundred Mongols managed to stumble out of the mountains, but what awaited them was worse than death. The slave markets. The Venetians, ever practical, had turned their misfortune into profit. The survivors weren't warriors anymore, just hollow-eyed men, mutilated and half-mad from starvation and cannibalism. Venetian traders bought them cheap from Hungarian peasants and sold them to the Egyptian Mamluks, who took grim pleasure in enslaving the sons of those who once enslaved the world. The slave ships were nightmares. Packed bodies chained in darkness, fed barely enough to survive the voyage. Many went mad. Others killed themselves on the chains. The children suffered a different fate. Boys under 10 were castrated and sold as eunuchs for palace service. Only a third survived the crude operation. Those who lived were trained to forget their Mongol blood, to guard the harems of the very empires their fathers had tried to destroy. The girls were scattered across the Mediterranean, sold to brothels under the title daughters of the conquerors, trophies for men who took pleasure in dominating the offspring of fallen legends. Venetian merchant Marco Sanudo wrote, "The Tatars make poor slaves, they refuse to work, they bite their overseers like wild dogs, and many hang themselves with their own chains." Back in Poland, Duke Boleslaw ordered a monument unlike any other. At Sandomierz, peasants built a church from the remains of their enemies. The mortar was mixed with ground Mongol bone. The walls were set with skulls arranged in crosses. The altar stone marked the place where Nogai Khan had been castrated. They called it the Church of Divine Vengeance. It stood for nearly 2 centuries before embarrassed clergy tore it down, calling it unchristian. But by then, the point had been made. The Mongol force of 30,000 was gone. Barely 500 crawled back to the Golden Horde, many missing ears, fingers, or worse, telling tales of poisoned earth and enemies without mercy. Yet Europe wasn't finished. News of victory spread fast, and soon every noble wanted Mongol heads for his walls. What followed was remembered as the Mongol Hunt of 1261 to 1263. Bounty hunters scoured the forests, and the Teutonic Knights sent cleansing parties deep into the east to wipe out stragglers. Their methods were creative and cruel. Captured Mongol scouts were doused in pitch, set ablaze, and sent running into their own camps like human torches. Hungarian Baron Bela preferred impalement, lining his borders with screaming Mongol corpses. The Golden Horde tried once more in 1262, sending 10,000 riders into Poland to avenge their dead. They didn't get far, only 30 miles past the border, before the church bells began to ring. The peasants had built their own alarm system, and the countryside was ready. Within hours, every village within 50 miles knew the Mongols were coming. Fields ahead of them burned, wells were poisoned, and mounted bands of Polish peasants, wolf packs, we called them, shadowed the enemy wherever they went. These weren't soldiers anymore. They were farmers who'd learned the Mongols' own tricks and turned them back against them. They struck at night, killed sentries, stole horses, poisoned supplies, then vanished into forests the Mongols couldn't read. Commander Burundi wrote in despair, "We are not fighting an army, but the land itself. Every tree hides an archer. Every stream is poisoned. My men fear to eat, to sleep, to drink. This is not war. This is being digested alive by a hostile country." After 2 weeks of this torment, the great Mongol army broke. As they limped back toward the border, Polish peasants picked off stragglers. And waiting for them there, on the hills, were children, laughing, throwing rocks, singing songs about the brave horsemen who ran from farmers. The warriors who once crushed kingdoms were now mocked by 7-year-olds. That retreat ended the Golden Horde's ambition in Central Europe. The transformation was complete. In 1241, Europe had trembled before the Mongols like sheep before wolves. By 1263, those same peasants wore necklaces of Mongol finger bones and drank from Mongol skulls. Their children played Hunt the Tartar with real helmets taken from the dead. The conquerors had become prey. The terror of the steppes was now a commodity in slave markets. And across Europe, people learned that the myth of Mongol invincibility could die. All it took was farmers who'd learned to be monsters. Stories traveled back along the Silk Road. Tales of peasants turning Mongol armies into dust, of generals castrated and children sold, of bones ground into church walls. Soon other nations under Mongol rule began to ask, if Polish farmers could destroy them, why can't we? Within a generation, the empire began to fracture. The Yuan dynasty fell in China. The Ilkhanate crumbled in Persia. The Golden Horde split apart and faded. The spell was broken, all because one small nation of farmers refused to die quietly. Archaeologists still find the truth buried in those mountains. Mass graves filled with frozen Mongol warriors, bones marked by teeth where hunger turned brother against brother. In Polish museums you can see the reworked farm tools, scythes, flails, hooks, reshaped for killing horsemen, passed down as family relics. Some old churches still hold secrets in their foundations. Stones rich with human calcium, the powdered bones of Mongol soldiers mixed into the mortar. The Mongols once called their empire the eternal blue sky. But even the eternal sky, it turned out, ends where a Polish peasant's scythe begins. They taught Europe how to be monsters, and Europe had learned too well. The last Mongol to leave Poland alive was a young scout named Kutuz. He had no ears, no nose, no fingers, all cut off by peasants. He made it home and lived another 40 years, warning young warriors never to cross into the land of death, where even the soil was poisoned and farmers wore Mongol bones as trophies. He always ended his story the same way. They say we were invincible. We were not. We were just men, far from home. Men who forgot that when you teach sheep to be wolves, one day, the sheep will eat you. He was right. The Mongols had forged their own executioners. They should have stayed in the steppes before they taught peaceful farmers how to slaughter gods.